Book review. Hey guys, it's been a while. Today we shall be discussing Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I know exactly what you're thinking.
One can't simply review Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. It's a polyphonic masterpiece.
We have to give a summary of the book before we get into that. Crime and Punishment follows the psychological decline of the main character Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov is this poor ex-student who's stuck in a rough position. He needs money, but is too proud to receive money from his mother and sister's self-sacrifice, so he hatches a plan. He basically plans to murder and rob an old pawnbroker who he owes money. After all, the old lady is an unscrupulous creature, so why not kill her? Raskolnikov holds to the view that it's the right of certain exceptional individuals to ignore or go beyond the limits of normative ethics. In Raskolnikov's mind, just as Napoleon was justified in the bloodshed he partook in, Raskolnikov would be justified by the great works he would go on to achieve once he had liberated himself from the chains of poverty. He also looked at things from a utilitarian lens, basically saying to himself that the pawnbroker is a dreadful creature who does nothing but cause people misery. Not only would murdering her be a good thing for society, but her suffering would be vastly offset by his future good. After ruminating on his plans, he eventually decides to enact them. After all, that would be the moral thing to do. First he steals an axe, then he visits her under the false pretense that he's there to pawn something off. When she looks away, he brings the blunt side of the axe down on her head, killing her. Unfortunately, her half-sister walks in, and in a panic he kills her too. He steals a small handful of her things, leaves most of her wealth behind, and escapes by sheer luck. Here's where Enlightenment thinking clashes with reality. In semi-delirious shock, he returns to his apartment and sleeps. He becomes ill, and this feverish psychological breakdown ensues. The way Dostoevsky writes, it's like you're losing your mind along with him. You feel physically sick. He's suspected and constantly tormented by guilt and paranoia, confused by how futile his attempts to justify his actions have become after the fact. A cruel irony becomes apparent. Even though he got away with it in the eyes of the law, the world, he wasn't able to escape his own conscience. However cruel Raskolnikov seems, even in his darkest hours he still has enough humanity to help pay for a drunkard's funeral and becomes close with the dead man's daughter Sonia. Sonia, the dead man's daughter, had prostituted herself off to help provide for his kids. She's supposed to be this Christ-like figure grounded by her social position/sin. Ultimately, it's her who prompts Raskolnikov to turn himself in. At a pivotal point in the book, after realizing that his philosophical views are naive, he's comforted by this Christian idea of forgiveness and redemption. He wants to believe in it, but he has a hard time. There's significant emphasis on the story of Lazarus and the question, did Christ really raise Lazarus from the dead? Lazarus. I am of course ignoring much of the story. There's a lot about Raskolnikov's sister and her suitors, but this paints an adequate picture for our purposes. Mikhail Bakhtin said, "A plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousnesses, a genuine polyphony of fully valid voices, is in fact the chief characteristic of Dostoevsky's novels. What unfolds in his works is not a multitude of characters and fates in a single objective world, illuminated by a single authorial consciousness. Rather, a plurality of consciousnesses, with equal rights and each in its own world, combined but are not merged in the unity of the event." It would take longer to dissect and analyze Crime and Punishment than it would to actually read the book. That being said, this is a book review, so I'm going to approach this both ways. The traditional way people go about reviewing a book, in which we assume a monologic, authorial intent, and then again, from the polyphonic perspective, which hopefully will demonstrate what makes Dostoevsky such a literary legend. The low-hanging interpretation of Crime and Punishment's plot, from a traditional perspective, is that it's critiquing the faulty ethical assumptions about human nature that were forming after God died, as Nietzsche so famously put it. These ideas are still prominent today. What happens when society at large doesn't believe in God anymore? Is there a basis for morality without a judgment day? What determines what's right or wrong if there is no God and there is no divine consequences? Can something like utilitarianism fill that void? Nietzsche is a personal favorite philosopher of mine, and he touches on very similar things as Dostoevsky. He actually read his work and famously said in Twilight of the Idols that, what's the quote? Nietzsche said of Dostoevsky, "He is the only psychologist from whom I had something to learn, and that he ranks amongst the most beautiful strokes of fortune in his life. They were both raised Christian, and they were both fully aware of the threat of nihilism, that it posed after the great Christian disenchantment. And most importantly, both of them took on the challenge to try and find a solution, more or less. Or at least it's fair to say that Dostoevsky's characters contend with that reality. And yet Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are polar opposites at the same time. You see, in complete opposition to Nietzsche's absolute hatred for orthodoxy, Dostoevsky had a strict religious adherence, and belief in Christianity is so much more than what my or our reductionist tendencies lead us to believe. It isn't just natural law theory with a little extra spice of mythology, nor is it some opiate just for dealing with existential questions. And that's why the question as to whether or not Lazarus actually rose from the dead is so important. In the Brothers Karamazov, there's this idea of love, something like the idea that freely choosing love in the face of suffering, humbling oneself before God, justifies the suffering in the world. And maybe even more importantly, the burden of freedom. To love is to suffer, and there can be no love otherwise. And love is self-justified. And this is all something hard to wrap your head around outside of the ecstasies of the religious experience, or maybe just outside the ecstasies of love. And we can compare Dostoevsky's views on suffering with that of Nietzsche's. Nietzsche's on tragedy. He basically believed suffering wasn't a bad thing, but something from which we can derive meaning. Through tragedy, we can transcend nihilism. We can sort of see both their answers to the initial idea that this book presents.
Raskolnikov must be punished as a murderer, but not ruined as a human. Sonia is the savior. She loves him. She is patient with him, and that leads to his atonement.
It's a different sort of life affirmation. It's all the Christ-like love to Nietzsche's Dionysian spirit, whichever. I don't care. Both are suitable answers to the problem.
But the issue with all of what I just said is that Raskolnikov isn't Dostoevsky. In fact, Raskolnikov isn't the entirety of the story, but for the sake of time, we're just limiting our discussion to Raskolnikov since he's the main character. This is the error I made in my previous review of Notes from Underground. The assumption that authors are just trying to express an idea puts literature in a box. Dostoevsky is revolutionary because he shatters that box. He isn't sharing ideas. He's giving birth to consciousnesses. You aren't reading what I claim to be Dostoevsky's answers to the problem of God's death. You're witnessing Raskolnikov, a human, in the face of it. This changes the analytical reader's role entirely. We were left to psychoanalyze the characters rather than interpret them. This is what makes Dostoevsky the king of psychological fiction. I can't tell you anything that captures what this book is. The only thing I can say with authority is how I related to the main character, Raskolnikov.
Raskolnikov is split. He is the unconscious and the ego, the mystic religious narrative transcendent, and the rational scientific objective. The only thing holding him back from his self-appointed Napoleonic destiny is this arbitrary set of indoctrinated values. You shouldn't murder old ladies. It's absolutely baseless. And he needs to prove it to himself. He needs to defy the normative ethics to prove he is a Napoleonic figure. Now, one could interpret the reality of Raskolnikov's conscience punishing him as a demonstration of the validity of that mythological fabric, Christianity, but they could also interpret it as a demonstration that it's far more difficult for us to escape culturally indoctrinated values than we think, or that morality has an unconscious biological basis. But in the end, the same conclusion is reached. We are confined by our consciences, which are rooted in something beyond our control. Raskolnikov hits this realization like a brick wall, and it shakes him to his core. Could it be that Christianity is true? Did Christ really raise Lazarus from the dead? For Raskolnikov, he doesn't seem to consider those last two interpretations of the reality he's faced with. Instead, he's foundationless. He's faced with the potential validity of Christianity, repentance, redemption, and love. Is it too good to be true? Did Christ really raise Lazarus from the dead? In a sense, by me bringing up those other two interpretations, I'm undermining Raskolnikov's experience. But these questions always take me down the same Jungian rabbit hole. And at the end of that rabbit hole, there's the same question, just as potent as ever. Did Christ really raise Lazarus from the dead? So I do think it's worth exploring so we aren't left with a cop-out. Normative ethics are deeply tied to our culture/mythology and psychology, and our mythology and psychology have shaped each other throughout the evolutionary process until these so-called religious truths, narrative truths, normative ethics are real. God, in the sense of cosmic justice, is ingrained in our psyche as a result of the belief in God and evolution, which was sparked by something else, mirror neurons or something. It really doesn't matter. The point is that it's been reaffirmed and ingrained over time. These narrative, religious, normative truths are in many cases more true than the scientific truths Raskolnikov finds so much pride and identity in. His inner louse nature has become more powerful than his self-aggrandized Napoleonic potential. Digressing further from the book and more into my thoughts while reading the book, since I was forced to consider the same questions Raskolnikov was, we ask ourselves, who's in the driving seat of religion? Religion may be pragmatically truthful as this book demonstrates, but why is religion what it is? Why does it have the power that it does? Why does Raskolnikov even consider the idea that Christ legitimately rose Lazarus from the dead? In other words, let's step from it doesn't matter if religion is arbitrary, it still has power to Is religion arbitrary? Religion is what's shaping humanity, and in return, humanity is shaping religion, moving closer and closer to some aim, conscious progression, individuation if you're young. Who's driving it? Some metaphysical collective unconscious force that's real and powerful? Or is it merely arbitrary Ubermensch-like Napoleonic figures who uproot religion and evolve it? Take Jesus, for example, someone who almost certainly existed historically speaking and completely changed the social imaginary. He took Old Testament Judaism and replaced it. Boom, Sermon on the Mount. The old laws replaced with higher principles, a new ethos, and through him, a new mythos. This is the process of the evolution of religion. A new Judeo-Hellenic synthesis emerges. And because it's more powerful psychologically than the previous mythologies, it dominates. This new doctrine shapes mass behavior, which in turn shapes evolution, which in turn shapes evolutionary psychology, which in turn gives psychological/biological basis for the truth/validity of the original religion. However, was this whole colossal shift in humanity's mass psychology/trajectory all him, or was it sort of a collective projection onto him? It's like us asking, were the atrocities of Nazi Germany Hitler's fault, or was Hitler merely a mouthpiece for the collective sentiment? Now, I just compared Jesus to Hitler, and that's a terrible example, but hopefully you get what I mean. So is the evolution of religion the result of some collective force, or is it certain Ubermensch individuals? If you were to say that the former is far more likely than the latter, then that leaves you scrambling in some somewhat mystical idea of the unconscious. What exists in the unconscious? A world where religious legitimacy doesn't stray so far from the realm of possibility that it's completely absurd. Somewhere where you start to consider maybe Christ really did raise Lazarus from the dead. And thus maybe we feel an inkling of what Raskolnikov was feeling. And where do you turn to cope with guilt if it isn't real? Can there be forgiveness, or is that just a permanent stain? You permanently defied the laws of cosmic justice. Furthermore, am I only considering this because I feel guilty? And this is just like, something that gives an escape, and I want to believe it, therefore I'm believing it, or have the temptation to believe. And we never get a happy answer. The book is left unfinalized, and that's another characteristic of Dostoevsky's work that makes it so powerful, is there is no happy conclusion. We're left with a painting of the human condition and a personality dealing with that human condition, or an aspect of the human condition. How do you make sense of a human life with human questions? How do I give a review of that? And I really haven't given a review of that. I've really just shared my thoughts and relating to what Raskolnikov is dealing with. A lot of people say that this is what converted them to Christianity, which at first I thought was silly. Really? A poor college dropout kills some old ladies and feels bad about it, and you're like, that convinces me? But after reading it, you really start to understand. It's beautiful, and those Christian archetypes have a lot of force to them. I imagine anyone who wasn't raised religious or is non-religious is looking at this and scoffing how pseudoscientific he is. And you're absolutely right. That's the point. That's the conflict. Why do people feel so strongly when they read it? I don't know. I'm an idiot. I know nothing. I apologize for ranting about the potential validity of Christianity again, but hey, that was a theme in the book, so I couldn't avoid it. I will, however, avoid it in the future, and no more talk of ion-related things. The truth is that the only thing I can say with any confidence is that this book is a 9 out of 10. If you do decide to read this book, you should pay particular attention to the subtle psychological significances. Dostoevsky is amazing at this. Things like Raskolnikov's relationship with his mother. Things like Raskolnikov's weird attraction to this sickly girl in the book. This weird attraction to suffering almost. Same reason he seems attracted to Sonia. Dostoevsky is an absolute psychological, artistic, and philosophical genius. He's just too powerful for my feeble mind. In conclusion, try not to kill old ladies. Thank you guys. Bye.